Amen. Please be seated. I will read for us as we have this time of invocation from Psalm 146, verses 1 and 2 and 5 to 8. Praise the Lord, O my soul. I will praise the Lord all my life. I will sing praise to my God as long as I live. Blessed is he whose help is in the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God, the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them, the Lord who remains faithful forever. He upholds the cause of the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. Let us bow our heads. Loving and liberating God, you who desire the freedom and flourishing of all creation, manifest yourself among us as we meet to recall and reflect on our history as a people. At this annual Emancipation lecture, prepare our hearts and minds to hear and receive what you have to say through your servant David Carty. God of liberation and justice, we thank you for this day. We bless you for your unfailing love, care, and concern for all who have been and are marginalized, oppressed, and enslaved throughout human history up to this very day. Today we give you thanks for your unfailing love. We thank you for your unfailing care and concern for the descendants of enslaved African people throughout the world, and especially in this land. We offer to you, O God, the thanksgiving and praise for hearing the cries of the oppressed. We bless your name for giving to us freedom. Freedom over all sorts of slavery. We thank you, O God, for your redeeming grace and love. Help us to remember who we are and from where we have come. Help us to remember the things you have done for us in the past so we can teach them to this present generation. And in so doing, O God, you will give to them the hope and enthusiasm for the future. We thank you for this time of reflection and remembering of our history as a people. May the information which will be imparted to us help to decolonize our mind. That as we hear the story, they will teach us, they will challenge us, and they will call us to learn from our ancestors and be challenged by their truth and their love. So give to us the strength, the motivation, the fortitude, and courage to continue to fight for social justice, to fight for equity, and to dismantle all systems of oppression in the hope that we shall overcome one day. Hear this our prayer, for we ask it in the name of Christ and through the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you very much, Reverend Celestine. Honorable Minister with Responsibility for Social Development, Ms. Deanne Kentish Rogers, and other members of the Anguilla House of Assembly, Superintendent Minister of the Methodist Church Anguilla Circuit, Ms. Reverend Vincia Celestine, our presenter, Mr. David Carty, congregational stewards and other circuit stewards and other officers of the Methodist Church, other pastors and members of other congregation, members of the Education Department, Mrs. Rita Celestine and other government officers, past presenters of the Emancipation Lecture, Mr. Carlyle Rogers, Dr. Ronald Harrigan, and Mr. Ken Banks, Mrs. Stella Gums, Roots Bingay, Ebenezer family, friends, colleagues, sisters, brothers, children, and those who are joining us via social and other media, via Ebenezer People Facebook page and YouTube channel, Lois Live, Radio Anguilla, or KCN Television, D3 Enterprises and Council Limited, our supporters, our Malliouhana Poetry Committee organizers, Ms. Avan Carty, Ms. Annika Hughes, Ms. Carla Harris, Ms. Janzi Webster, and Ms. Renee Henry. Good evening, and welcome to Ebenezer. Dedicated some 194 years ago, this edifice was constructed by the hands of our ancestors and was the place where they would have gathered just about 190 years ago on August 1st, 1834, to celebrate the first Emancipation Day, the day when the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 came into effect in the British Empire. This lecture series was inspired by UWI alumnus and activist and former superintendent of the Methodist Church on Anguilla, the late Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gums. Lest we forget. That was one of his favorite sayings. He constantly reminded and admonished us that the commemoration of emancipation is a must. We must continually remind ourselves of the struggles and the triumphs of our ancestors. We must teach our children from whence we came, lest we forget. This now annual lecture began in 2016 and continues to be held here at Ebenezer, because as Ebenezer, this stone of remembrance is an important symbol of our emancipation. And so as we continue to shape our remembrance and celebrate the resilience of our ancestors, we must also continue to pay tribute to the life and work of Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gums, and we are doing so through the Malliouhana Poetry Committee Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gums Award, which will be presented later in the program. This evening, I am delighted and honored to welcome back our esteemed chairperson, one of Anguilla's outstanding scholars, a woman who has my utmost respect and admiration. She's a career educator. She's a believer in and a promoter of independent and lifelong learning. And we are pleased and honored that she so readily agreed to be part of another emancipation celebration. For, as she says, it is essential, vital even, that as members of the African diaspora, we all seek to bend our minds to an unraveling of the past, as this can only lead to a better grasp of self in the present. She is the holder of degrees from the University of the West Indies, the Université des Antilles, Guyane, and the University of London. And prior to her current role, she specialized in the teaching of English language and literature, communication studies, and French. For the past 6 years, she has served as principal of the Albina Lake Arch Comprehensive School. And as recently announced, she's currently in transition to the post of Education Officer, Professional Development in the Department of Education. ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, let us all now thank, congratulate, and welcome our chairperson for this evening, the indomitable and beautiful Mrs. Rita Celestine Carty.
I thank Dr. Fleming Banks for that introduction. It is an introduction, so I guess she's speaking about me, so I am here, and I must say that I am elated to serve as your hostess, I'll call it, this evening to guide you through this very enriching program that includes a discussion session at the end, so I urge you to prepare for that even now. So as congratulations are in order, I congratulate the Malliouhana Poetry Committee for once again creating this event for us. It's important, and they did it for us. So please give them a round of applause. I will now at this time invite the Honorable Minister of Social Development and Education, Ms. Deanne Kentish-Rogers, to deliver brief remarks.
Good evening, everyone. Please excuse me if you see me cough or turn away for a second. This annual Emancipation Lecture forms a critical part of our collective consciousness as a people. Very often, when we reflect on and speak to the reality of emancipation, the first thing that comes to the mind of most people is carnival. But carnival is the after. The before is the journey and the transition that we and our ancestors had to go through to get to this point. Even though this evening, which I must thank the Malliouhana Poetry organizers for their steadfast insistence on this annual Emancipation Lecture, but any event like this should be a national enterprise. It should be one that is not only limited to persons who have a particular interest in our historical past, but to our schools, our youngest of students. It should be something that is touted and well appreciated at every point within our school system and on the streets of our communities. And when I contemplate our history and the significance of what knowing about it means, I reflect on my own interaction with information about emancipation. And I must admit that it was only after I had become an adult that I formed a curiosity about Anguilla's emancipation. And if that is the case for me, I can tell you with certainty that that is more than likely the case for thousands and thousands of young Anguillians. That being said, this is an opportunity for us to develop a strong sense of national and Anguillian identities. I contemplate nations with very strong identities and what they do to preserve such identities, like Israel, although we may not, despite what their actions are today, I think a trip to Israel will show you that every student at the age of 7 is required to visit the Holocaust Museum. Every student and every child of a particular age is required to sit examinations specifically targeted to remembering their history related to the Holocaust. Now, historically speaking, many persons draw parallels between the Holocaust, the horrors of the Holocaust, and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. But without a concerted effort to document and to share with our youngest and most impressionable people that sense of national identity, it will surely be lost. And so this evening, I come with open ears, as it was only last year that I heard of the story of a ship called the Lady Rose that traveled from Nevis to Anguilla and brought a shipment of slaves to our shores. Now that information was very critical for me, and I held on to it, as you can tell, very closely. But I think this information should be widely disseminated, widely researched. It should be something we consider to be of a national priority. So this evening, I come with open ears, as I said, to listen to Mr. Carty and the discussions that follow about Anguilla's emancipation, cultural anchors and myths, and re-envisioning our emancipation journey. Thank you, and good evening.
Thank you, Minister, and I endorse every single word that she said. And now at this time, we will have a selection by the Ebenezer Men's Fellowship.
in the water. wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade.
Thank you very much to the Ebenezer Men's Fellowship, and I would like to ask the Malliouhana Poetry Committee to organize a discussion on that song. It intrigues me a lot, and it was performed so well this evening. I think we need to dig deep and really understand Wade in the Water. Please give them another round of applause. And now I'll tell you a little bit about the Reverend Dr. Wycherley Gumbs Award for Creative Nonfiction. This is a tribute by the organizing committee of the Malliouhana Poetry Competition to the late Reverend Dr. Gumbs, a renowned Anguillian Methodist minister, author, and poet. Reverend Dr. Gumbs' work, whether theological, academic, or artistic, was largely directed to issues related to personal and national emancipation, selfhood, authenticity, culture, and creativity. The creative nonfiction genre therefore provides an opportunity for a more sustained consideration of the historical, social, cultural, and economic issues that formed the core of his writing. And now this year's award will be presented by Ms. Renee Henry, Ms. Avon Carty, and Mrs. Stella Gumbs.
Good evening, everyone. This year, thank you, Mistress Carty, for that wonderful introduction. So I don't have to do that. Thank you guys for listening attentively. So we'll move right into it. This year, the committee will honor the top 2 submissions. And here to make the presentation this evening, as Mistress Carty said, is Reverend Gumbs' wife, Mistress Stella Gumbs, and committee member, Ms. Avon Carty. The prizes this evening includes a plaque, certificate, and a cash voucher through the contributions of our generous sponsors, Council Corporate Services and D3 Enterprises. I'll read a bit of description of the 2 entries before I call the writers. So the first entry, this one, highlighted the realities of life in Anguilla without modern-day amenities and provided details of local cultural aspects. It examined the life of a cultural icon and the impacts of church, cooking, sewing, and sports on the development of culture. Through this reflection, traditions were passed down and the importance of community and togetherness were portrayed. This submission was made by Mr. Charlene Gumbs and is entitled My Cultural Icon. We'll welcome Ms. Gumbs. And Ms. Gumbs takes 2nd place this year. Our next submission outlined the social and economical trends associated with migration and in ways that it shaped many Anguillan expressions and activities that are now normalized, zoning in on the evolution of migration from the days of the early settlers to the arrival of tourists at the Blowing Point Ferry Terminal. The emphasis was placed on the resiliency of the Anguillan people to be conditioned by the challenges and opportunities that migration has caused over the years through a social, cultural, and economic lens. This submission was made by Dr. Timothy Hodge, and it is entitled, Leaving the Island. Dr. Hodge? And Dr. Hodge takes first place yet again for the Reverend Richley Gomes Award. Congratulations, Dr. Hodge. Come on, Dr. Hodge. Okay. Excellent. Can we give another round of applause to our participants and winners? I'd also like to take this opportunity to encourage more persons to participate and use this as an opportunity to continue the legacy of Reverend Gomes in writing and expression. Thank you.
We say thank you to the presenters, and we say thank you to the writers as well. They are really doing a good job, and I'm sure that we'll soon be able to have a publication of their submissions. So thank you to Charlene, and thank you to Dr. Gomes. At this time, we will have the collection of offering in support of the Ebenezer Building Restoration Fund, while we are entertained by a staple of the Emancipation lecture, Roots Bingi. Thank you to Ruth Spingy, and thank you too for your contributions. And if you were not able to contribute this evening and you'd like to do so via direct transfer, and even if you did and you want to give more, top it up, you can do so at, I'm sure this is NCBA, bank account numbers 2019651 for US dollars and 2021079 for EC dollars. So I'll repeat those again because I don't see anybody making notes in their phones. So you could put it in the notes in your phones, but I guess, if you're rewatching this lecture, you could hear the numbers, but I'll still give them. So it's 2019-651 for US dollars. So see, I gave you a mnemonic just now, 2019-651. And for EC dollars, 2021-079. 2021-079. And now we are very close to the main event of this evening. And I want you to know that it is very important that we don't leave this activity and this venerable place in the same way that we came. We have to be different when we go out through the doors. Reverend Celestine prayed that we be receptive to what will be shared with us, and our honorable minister said that she's all ears. So everybody has to follow her example, and I'm going to ensure that this is the case and guarantee our transformation. So I want us to focus on some key words in the title of this evening's lecture. What do you think those would be? Okay, I'm hearing mumblings, and I'm not going to do the pause and pounce that I do in classrooms. I'm going to tell you what I chose. I chose anchor, I chose myths, I chose journey. So what is an anchor? We use anchors to stay in a certain place, don't we? But we also pull them up so that we can move on to another place. We know that myths have no basis in fact. And the word journey makes it clear to me that emancipation was or is not an act with a capital A that came into effect on a particular date. It says to me that it is something else, and it also says that it is ours, not our ancestors. And why the word revisioning? Why that word? Is it that we are being invited to create new mental pictures, to view things differently, or I dare say to experience them differently? You're going to help me to figure out these questions and more. So now I invite Ms. Jancy Webster to introduce our lecturer.
Good evening, everyone. Builder of ideas, words, and tactical things, David Carty truly represents a man for all seasons. Whether the role of an educator, a historian, a writer, mentor, public speaker, boat builder, or activist, he believes in the importance of the written and spoken word in nurturing a sense of national and regional identity to underpin the preservation, the passing down, and the ongoing development of culture. Mr. David Carty is a graduate of the University of the West Indies and a student of history. In his role as a public servant, he served as a graduate teacher, director of tourism, parliamentary secretary in the Ministry of Education, and speaker of the House of Assembly. He has also served on various advisory committees to do with public policy, as well as pioneering community organizations like the Angular Archaeological and Historical Society, the Angular National Trust, and the Caribbean Conservation Association. In his private life, Mr. Carty owns and operates a boat building company of Rebel Marine Limited, which is dedicated to the to maintaining and continuing the excellence of Anguilla boat building tradition. For many years, Mr. Carty has been and still is an avid advocate of environmental and cultural issues. His burning concern about the effects of climate change resonates with the global discourse for raising awareness. His concern for environmental issues and sustainable development is viewed in the wider context of cultural growth. As a distinguished cultural bearer, David Carty continues to pour his passion into connecting us with his treasure chest of knowledge, memories, and skills. He's already the author of the book Nothing Baffling, the story of the Anguilla racing boat, and the producer of the documentary film of the same title. He's currently working on a book of short stories related to Anguilla's seafaring past and a series of illustrated historical talks. We eagerly await the release of these publications, but tonight we take great pleasure in welcoming Mr. Carty to the podium as he invites us to explore cultural anchors and myths, revisioning our emancipation journey. Mr. Carty.
Good evening. I must begin by thanking the Malliouhana Poetry Organizing Committee for inviting me to give this lecture. It came as a surprise, given the erudition of previous lecturers on this historic anniversary, and also given the reality of my own creeping irrelevance in a fast-changing culture, in which I myself am almost a relic. I fully concede, in the paraphrased words of Lord Byron's poem, Prisoner of Shillong, that my hair is white, and yes, with years, nor grew it white in a single night, as men's have grown with sudden fears. The years march on, and I can only hope that some utility may be gained in what I have to say this evening, even though my perspective may be jaundiced by a fading view of history. I may as well warn you also that what follows has little academic respectability. I offer this brief paper as a commentary on our history. You are free to consider it an irritant rather than a set of answers. I've also been asked to widen the discussion a bit from a focused view of the historic marker, which was 1834, and to take a look at the historic implications and linkages of that period in our culture, and influences which have endured until today, whether they be real or imagined. Lastly, you will forgive me if, in illustrating some point, I use some story or anecdote which you have already heard. I do so only as a point of emphasis. Jonathan Haidt, an American social psychologist and author of the recently published book, The Anxious Generation. In it, he lays out the facts about the epidemic of teenage mental illnesses that has hit many countries since 2010, and how smartphones and social media are largely to blame for this malady. The anxiety problem, he argues, supported by copious data, comprised primarily of anxious thoughts, emotion of anxiety itself, and anxious behaviors. These habits negatively affect competence, confidence, character, caring, and connection. Although the data he employs to make his ultimate case for action is based on data obtained in the US and a few Western nations, I am sure such data could also be replicated in many other countries. And certainly, I suspect, in our own small corner of the world, where we too are in a state of heightened concern on this issue. But in truth, one could widen the scope of the title Anxious Generation to include the general state of anxiety today across all generations. As globally we face wars that could have ripple effects across international trade and economy, mass migration and the heightened knock-on effects of intolerance, racism, and poverty, climate swings and an ever-increasing litany of natural disasters, the list goes on and on. Locally, we too are becoming anxious about our own issues, cost of living, threat of hurricanes, and most of all, the alarming state of gun violence among young men. We are all suffering from some anxiety. This is not exclusive domains of teenagers. It is in large part a factor not only of economics and the daily realities faced by us all, but now piled on higher and deeper by non-stop, wall-to-wall, 24/7 news from every corner of the globe, easily accessible on our phones and bent towards negativity. As the old newspaper mantra used to say, if it bleeds, it leads. Bad news sells, and the news is big business. So if we are not careful, our very psychologies are being warped into a permanent ethos of anxiety. And I use the definition of ethos deliberately here to mean the characteristic spirit of a culture, era, or community, as manifested in its attitudes and aspirations. We are here this evening to commemorate emancipation, freedom. And we would do well to distinguish between that pointed transformative event in 1834 that initiated a very painfully slow process of change, and that of the blindingly fast transformations taking place around us today, in the context of a revisited concept of freedom, and by extension, our identity as the descendants of those ancestors who tiptoed across a legal line on the 1st of August, 190 years ago. Indeed, I would like to grapple in what I am sure will be an inadequate way with the factor of our identity as a people and how that has come about through history, traditions, and myths, and how that is changing for better and for worse. I would wish to take a brief look at what I describe as our cultural anchors and whether they are holding in the storms of contemporary society. National identity, that amorphous sense of who we are, is powerfully influenced by origins. Origins arise from history, heritage, and myths. The first two are largely fixed, depending on historical analysis, while myths are a concoction of stories, part true, but exaggerated, that usually embellishes history with the purpose of obtaining more collective or individual significance. But myths do not change history or heritage. In the case of Anguilla, my view of our identity rests with a specific period of our past, which has influenced our culture and which we would do well not to forget. Our whole history, Anguilla's whole history, can be broadly categorized into three parts: colonization from 1650 up to 1796, 1796 up to 1967, 1967 to the present. Our cultural norms and origins arise mainly from the second period, 1796 to 1967, while the last period, from 1967, is still a work in progress. Tonight, my main focus, which includes emancipation in 1834, is on part two. In 1826, 8 years before emancipation, the House of Commons issued a report which inquired into the state of the community in the island of Anguilla. It is depressing reading from cover to cover and can be illustrated by the following excerpt, and I quote, "It is enough to say that the colony in general is in a most wretched condition, both as it relates to its internal government and the resources of its inhabitants. As to the first of these, nothing could be worse. There is not a semblance of law or justice, and consequently acts of the greatest outrage are committed with impunity. With regard to the resources of the island, they are poor indeed. The remote causes of this are attributable in the first instance to the devastation of the French armament sent here by Victor Hughes. They burnt and destroyed the little town and every place in it. Before this period, the island is said to have been comparatively populous and flourishing. Their subsequent poverty has prevented their ever recovering from this disaster. It has always been my view that as pivotal as the events of 1967 were to modern Anguilla, the French invasion of 1796 was equally pivotal to what emerged as Anguillian society and culture throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. You will note that the record speaks to a comparatively populous and flourishing community prior to the terror of that war. And we should bear in mind that Anguillian society prior to 1796 was like every other society in the Caribbean at that time, rigidly structured by race and class and bound by an accepted order of exploitation of land and forced labor for the accumulation of colonial wealth. Slave society through and through. 1796 changed that completely by the extensive destruction that ensued, plunging master and slave, black and white, into a new order of what can only be described as subsistence existence on the brink of extinction. Almost all the traditional colonial structures collapsed, including religion, when the first St. Mary's Church was burnt to the ground, leaving a space, a social and economic vacuum that had to be filled. I believe that we have all heard the myth that there was no slavery in Anguilla. Where does that absurdity originate? It's commonly used sometimes in the tourist industry to ameliorate any foreign perceptions of racial tension within the island. Consider and bear in mind that myth depends in part on fact. So let us look at three of these facts. In his magisterial volume, Slave Populations of the British Caribbean, 1807 to 1834, Emancipation 1834, historian B.W. Hickman touched on slave societies in marginal colonies. Marginal colonies were Barbuda, the Bahamas, Belize, Caymans, the Virgin Islands, and Anguilla. To be clear, the term marginal colony simply denotes an economic rating, if you will, of that colony. It was of marginal significance to the metropole, and nowhere as valuable as, say, Jamaica, Barbados, or St. Kitts, for example. Hickman says this about the salt trade, which was common in some of the marginal colonies, particularly Anguilla and the Bahamas. Now, the Turks and Caicos are now, were then part of the Bahamas. Hickman says this: salt rakers also performed heavy labor on seasonal basis. In the Bahamas, the salt ponds were opened annually to all free people who were required only to give lists of all Negroes and servants to be employed by them in raking the salt. Salt ponds were free for everybody. You just go in, if you were free, before 1834, and you could collect. And of course, you didn't collect, your slaves collected for you. In Anguilla, the council appointed commissioners for each division of the island. Remember, in the old days, they had the Spring Division in the east, the Valley in the middle, the Road in the west. For each division of the island, who inspected the salt pond and appointed constables to keep out trespassers. When the reaping day came, less than an annual occurrence, once a year, in the early 19th century, a gun was fired early in the morning, and the slaves rushed forward to gather as much as they could for their owners. A gun was fired again at 2 p.m., when the slaves, it was said, would reap for themselves. So how and why could slaves reap for themselves? Were they allowed to sell salt? Certainly not. The only possible explanation could be for subsistence. If they could, as we used to say, corn their own food, however little it may have been, it allowed a saving of some sort for the slave owner. But crucially, it showed that slaves participated in the economy, pathetic though it was, for their own benefit, a circumstance unheard of and impossible in normal slave society. The reality, it must be said, was not based on altruism or Christian kindness on the part of the slave owners. No, it was based on the harsh practicality of subsistence. To emphasize this point, one need only juxtapose that history against that of India and the Great Salt March of 1930, led by Mahatma Gandhi, which was a non-violent protest directed against the British government's tax on salt, which greatly affected the poorest of Indians. The protest was violently repressed, and Gandhi was jailed for it by the same empire who 100 years before was allowing slaves in Anguilla to pick their own salt. An interdependence for everyone, black and white, wrought by poverty and the collapse of any semblance of government, had begun. Again, if I may quote from the 1826 House of Commons report under the heading Colonial Government Expenses, it reads, "The island is more immediately governed by a deputy lieutenant governor and a council, but no assembly or other legislative body. This deputy has no salary, but receives a trifling fee on vessels arriving at the port," unquote. To put it more clearly, Anguilla's government was conducted by an assistant to the governor in St. Kitts, and was paid next to nothing. How efficient was that? The second historical fact, and part source of the myth, that there was no slavery in Anguilla, is found in the formative years of our own Christian tradition. Again, I will quote even more extensively from the House of Commons report to support the view. Under the heading Religious Establishment, it reads, "The only vestige of religious establishment found in Anguilla is a branch of the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society, at the head of which, as minister, is a colored man, a native of the island. The admitted members of the society consist of about 250. The congregation may amount to 300 or 400. It has been established for 11 years, that means in 1815, well before emancipation, under the superintendence of the same minister. The congregation is increasing. About 60 members have been admitted this year. There are about 50 members who are white. The rest are principally slaves. Upon the report of the minister, it seems that the slaves have always the opportunity of attending service on Sunday. They also attend class meetings on evenings of other days in the week. There is only one place of public worship. Remember, St. Mary's is destroyed. the minister considers that his flock would be greatly increased if he had the opportunity of seeking out the slaves. But this cannot be done, he not having a horse. That many are prevented from attending him on account of their extreme poverty, not having clothes to make a decent appearance. The missionary meets with no opposition in any case to his labors and devotes his whole time to the duties of his mission. Note 3 points. 50 of the 300 to 400 members are white. That is roughly 15% of the membership. Why is that significant? The average ratio of whites to blacks in any viable slave society just before emancipation was very low. For instance, in 1810 in Nevis, a very prosperous slave society, the percentage population of slaves was as high as 89.6%. In Anguilla, it was 77%. In Nevis, the population of whites was 4.1%, tiny. In Anguilla, it was 12%. The only standing church in 1826, thanks to the War of 1796, was on this very spot. Built by slaves, led by a colored man, after whom we have named this adjacent road in his memory. And he had 50 white people in his congregation. A colored man preaching to 50 white people before emancipation. The appropriate response to that in modern Gwili would simply be, aya. I won't finish the rest of the phrase. We are on sacred ground. Let me help to emphasize the significance of that point. John Hodges' work was sanctioned by the official we earlier mentioned, or the assistant to the governor in St. Kitts, who was paid a trifle. He sanctioned John Hodges' work. He had the sense to sanction John Hodges' work because of the near total collapse of all morality at that time. Juxtapose that fact with the history of Barbados, a top-tiered and very prosperous slave society, through and through. In that same year, 1825, when Barbadians, supported by the governor himself, hounded and persecuted any and every Methodist minister sent from England, effectively and almost completely destroying the Methodist mission in that island. You have to bear in mind that just before emancipation, the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Moravians were the most active in the abolition movement. The last Methodist minister from England had to escape by small sloop to St. Vincent to save his own life. The only person who maintained the Methodist Mission Society in Barbados was Sarah Ann McGill, who stood up to the blatant racist persecution and who is now a national hero. She was a colored woman. Colored woman in Barbados, colored man in Anguilla, same empire, same region, completely different circumstance. The third reality is one that we are all familiar with, but too often ignore, and is perhaps one of the more powerful influences on our history and culture: the systemic reality of drought. If one looks at the colonial accounts of revenues of the Leeward Islands throughout the 19th century, which included Dominica at that time, you will almost always never find a revenue head for Anguilla. Montserrat, one of the smallest of the Leewards, is always recorded. And of course, Antigua, St. Kitts, and Nevis lead the pack continuously as the most lucrative, followed closely by Dominica and Montserrat. The reason is simple and obvious. Bereft of large tracts of volcanic soil and having no real hills or mountains to capture convection currents, and produce rainfall. Persistent aridity was Anguilla's natural state. In 1826, only 1/10 of the island was under cultivation, producing in a good year 120 tons of sugar and 100,000 bushels of salt, followed by yams, potatoes, and a little cotton. But those numbers, paltry as they were, represented good years. Time after time, the records show deprivation and drought, culminating in the famines of the 1840s and the 1890s, which prompted the British government to advocate the complete evacuation of the island to the southern colonies of Dominica, Trinidad, and what is now Guyana. A policy position documented in Mr. Petty's book, Bless Our Forebears, documented fully in Mr. Petty's book, Bless Our Forebears, and one the Anguillians thankfully rejected. The fact that by 1967, most of the land on the island was owned privately, much of it in small holdings and not by the state or government, was a result of the collapse of the plantation system, triggered first by the War of 1796 and sealed by the persistence of drought. That in turn triggered a large poor white emigration from the island, where that population, which stood at 17.4% in 1810, had fallen by 1800, 4 years before emancipation, 1830, 4 years before emancipation, to 9.1%, which meant that nearly 50% of them had left the island. This reality allowed former slaves to procure lands, incredibly in some instances by outright purchase and by squatting or long possession. It is worth remembering today that the widespread ownership of land in Anguilla by the descendants of slaves within 2 generations of emancipation was and is a crucial element of the modern financial system. It is also worth remembering that this fact of land ownership by the descendants of slaves, in combination with continued poverty, was the genesis of the jollification, which helped to cement a spiritual connection with the land and ensured the failure of British evacuation policy. All these historical realities have their genesis in our history of drought. And if we fast forward to today, so it also affects the success of our tourism industry, which relies heavily on the geographic reality of the quality of our beaches. Our beaches would not be the same had we had rivers and streams running into the ocean, depositing runoff and runoff in the process. Drought and consequent aridity are the big reason why we have such great beaches. As the late great Prime Minister of Dominica, Dame Eugenia Charles, said to the late CM Sir Emile Gomes on our first visit to Anguilla, "I will gladly swap you 10 of our rivers for one of your beaches." But we must circle back to the main point, the myth of there being no slavery in Anguilla. The fact that I have tried to show, the War of 1796, aggravated by persistent drought, and social and economic and institutional collapse, as a result, a strange codependence, though still unequal, developed between master and slave post-1796, and then emerged post-emancipation into what I believe was a very unique society. This codependence ameliorated much, though not all, of the brutish norms of slavery, as both black and white, slave and free, struggled to eke out a living on this island. So far as I can tell, I may be corrected, there are hardly any records of any celebration for emancipation on the 1st of August, 1834, with the exception of this very spot where some celebration was held under the leadership of John Hodge. So are myths just useless fairy tales? Should we, in our strive to eliminate anything from our past not supported by historical fact, do myths have any utility? The late Joseph Campbell, one of the world's preeminent scholars on the power of myths, had this to say in one of his books, Primitive Mythology. He quotes, "Man apparently cannot maintain himself in the universe without belief in some arrangement of the general inheritance of myth. In fact, the fullness of his life would even seem to stand in direct ratio to the depth and range not of his rational thought, but of his local mythology." Campbell argues myths are useful. Well, are they? Back to us, and fast forward to 1938. The Methodist Church produced a cultural evening at the then Adrian T. Hazel Auditorium in 2013 to celebrate Aldersgate Sunday. Each society presented a production in either dance, music, or drama. At Zion in North Hill, we produced a play based on an old program that my late mother had blessedly kept, given to her by her late and good friend and beloved Nurse Mary of South Hill. It was a pamphlet printed in 1938 celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Bethel Methodist Church and contained messages of congratulation from 6 Methodist ministers who had served here in the past. One message struck me deeply, out of which we created quite an interesting small play involving 20 members of the church. The central character whose message was the crux of the play was the Reverend A.E. Belboda, who served here during World War I and again in 1923. He was a tall, black minister born in St. Kitts. His part was played by my good friend, Monsell Lloyd, who, dressed in a black gown borrowed from the late Reverend Lloyd, looked the part in every respect. But the important thing was what Reverend Belboda wrote of his impression of Anglican society just 78 years after formal emancipation, which was the crux of our play. This is what he wrote. "Twice it was my privilege to labor amongst you, and to this day, your love and devotion are deeply engraved on my heart. There are few places in the Lesser Antilles where Methodism has nurtured a worthier type of Christian, deeply religious, independent and loyal, sturdy and industrious, kind, respectful, and generous. Your name is honorably mentioned throughout the whole West Indies. Your highly developed instinct for ordered home life was one of the most beautiful features of your community, and one hopes and prays that you are retaining and developing this which lies at the very foundation of all progress in civilization, religion, and virtue. In all your gratitude for the past, you will not forget your responsibility to the future. The future of your church and island depends on the faithfulness and devotion of you of this present generation. If you neglect, spurn, or corrupt with superstition your religious heritage, you will hand down to those who come after you things less pure and strong. In this way, you will have robbed the next generation of the opportunities you had of becoming wise, strong, virtuous, and progressive, and thus you would be arraigned as criminals before the bar of history. The noble pride, the adoring gratitude, and the holy resolve and effort in which your service and sacrifice would inspire them are your highest crown. You would lose this if you play truants to today, and they would lose the example and inspiration of your devoted endeavor. See that you do not unwittingly commit this great crime by any slackness on your part." And he ends with a quote from Revelation, "Hold fast that which you have." The French invasion and consequent destruction of Anguilla in 1796 destroyed with it the institutional trappings of slave plantation societies so common throughout the entire Caribbean, and which persisted in most of them long after emancipation in 1834 and well into the 20th century, even as far as the 1960s. Anguilla was an outlier, to use a borrowed term from statisticians, not by design, but by accident, brought about by violent destruction, drought, and grinding poverty. The codependence between slave and master prior to 1834 and between black and white after emancipation, though imbalanced in many ways, was real and set a different trajectory of social relations in which elitism was diluted, extreme wealth versus abject deprivation was non-existent, and institutions of colonial authority were less authoritarian, not because of any altruism, but simply because of the scarcity of resources necessary to maintain the imperial and colonial social trappings so critical to maintaining then British systems of control. American historian Nancy Eisenberg, in her award-winning book, White Trash, supports this by showing the striking reality of codependence between poor whites and poor blacks in the southern US, where many lived next to each other and traded with each other. And she differentiated that class of persons, black and white, with rich plantation owners who controlled and owned almost everything and who manipulated legislative control to create the Jim Crow systems of the racist South. There were no rich white plantation owners in Anguilla post-1796. Everyone was scrunting, and therein lies the myth. There was no slavery in Anguilla. So again, we ask the question inferred by Joseph Campbell. Do myths have any useful purpose? Perhaps they do. Perhaps. 3 cultural anchors emerged from the ruin of 1796 and blossomed in the late 19th and early 20th century, right through to 1967. The ethos of, or characteristic spirit of a culture, already mentioned, of cutting and contriving to repurpose a well-known saying became a norm, and doing what you could with what you had was just the way it had to be. The exodus of so many poor whites from the island between 1830 and onwards allowed for land distribution and ownership to morph away gradually from white control to that of the former slaves and their descendants, which in turn rooted a sense of belonging and, I suggest, identity. The development of the jollification could only have happened if those who could only afford to butcher a goat or buy a smuggled demijohn of sweet gin to pay for their neighbor's help owned or controlled a piece of land that they could hold up and plant. They had to be landowners, small as they were. The jollification triggered a variety of communal events, also seen in the hauling and launching of schooners and sloops and the building of homes. This persisted right through to the early 1970s, evidenced by the pouring of house roofs. In addition to land ownership and the forced necessity of a communal economy, there was the remarkable development of the schooner and sloop fleets, triggered by the salt trade and phosphate mining on Sombrero, which helped to create a skilled cadre of shipwrights and mariners who were, by the early 20th century, building and repurposing extraordinary vessels seemingly from nothing. This fleet, which became a veritable bridge for the movement of wage earners to more prosperous islands, and which enabled 2 further socio and economic trends of significance: seasonal migration, and social and political awareness. Like so many whites who had emigrated, the descendants of slaves had to do likewise. But in large measure, theirs was a seasonal migration to the cane fields of the Dominican Republic for 6 months and to the oil refineries of Curacao and Aruba. But it is significant to note that this migration, enabled by the fleet of homegrown vessels, exposed Anguillians to more developed societies, established a more conscious diaspora, and seeded political awareness, culminating in the actions of 1967. These social arrangements, buttressed by the spread of Christian teaching by a revitalized and rebuilt Anglican community in the Valley and in the East, and to the continued growth here of the Methodist Church and in the West, are the basis of Belbora's observation that the characteristics of that generation was one of deeply religious, independent, loyal, sturdy, industrious, kind, respectful, generous. The cultural anchors of frugality, communal socio-economics, spiritual discipline, a strong loyalty to family and home have served Anguilla well and can easily be argued to have been the basis of our success in 1967 and in the development of high-end tourism. That is the subject of another conversation. But there can be no doubt that these anchors are slipping today, as we have, on our own volition, voted to integrate ourselves fully into a global capitalistic economy. That invasive power and the power of the internet, social media, pornography, the erosion of Christian values, the adoption of borrowed laws, rules, and regulations without cultural oversight have weakened us culturally and spiritually, while at the same time making us more individually and superficially prosperous. To be sure, glimpses of the past described above still show up in both expected and unexpected ways. Our love for family remains strong, as does our love for land, even though that love can become very irrational at times. Although we have become more selfish, by and large, I think we are still fairly industrious and loyal, although that too may trigger a debate. Boat racing still sails through the present as a reminder of a fascinating past in which the sea was central to our survival. And it is important to note that while indigenous boat racing did exist for decades in many different forms all across the Eastern Caribbean, they are now practically all extinct, with the extension of Martinique with the yole, Bequia with the double ender, and in Anguilla. And in Anguilla, the sport is not only alive, but booming. In this, you would note that when you look at a cricket match, you should note that when you look at a cricket match at the Webster Park or a football match at the Raymond Guichard Complex, you are looking at 22 players competing in 2 teams. When you look at an A-class Anguillian boat race, you are looking at least 275 players competing in 13 teams, and they hail from every corner of the island, from Island Harbor to West End. That is a direct inheritance of the migration to the Dominican Republic, Curacao, and Aruba. Although the traditional jollification has been lost through modern farming methods, the invention of the supermarket, the innovation of the construction contract, and cement pumps, it still perks up its head in a most unexpected way at funerals. Anguillians turn up in droves to attend a funeral, even when they barely know the deceased, and sometimes even when they do not know them at all. This is not just a habit for politicians. To be sure, it's not just an Anguillan thing, it is also true of some parts of the region. When my late father, the Reverend C.L. Carty, served in St. Kitts at a time when only the grapevine and the tolling of a church bell would announce a funeral, and before the time of radio death announcements and nicely printed funeral programs, he once told me that at every single funeral he conducted, he noticed a lady in attendance who was not a member of his church and whom he did not know. On one occasion, after committal of the departed soul in Springfield Cemetery, he noticed the lady walking as he was driving home. With curiosity, he stopped, offered her a lift, which she gladly accepted. They exchanged pleasantries, and she introduced herself, after which she asked him, quite matter of fact, "But Reverend, well, who 'tis we just buried?" You should notice the pronoun we. Who 'tis we just buried. It is a strange but touching throwback to a culture of communal participation. And at a funeral, we bury the dead. Perhaps you can think of other ways in which our culture clings to some way to our history and heritage, which I have not noted. It is a worthwhile exercise as it probes the origins of who we are and illuminates a sense of identity. As for me, on a personal note, and on the issue of identity, I like the myth that there was no slavery on Anguilla, even though I know the truth. Because as important, historical, and profound as emancipation in 1834 was to the enslaved all over the British Empire, we should always remember that in large part it was a British construct. My good friend and brilliant theater artist, Roald Gibbons of Trinidad, adopts the philosophy that the Caribbean is a space of freedom, and emancipation was only one step in its journey. He inverts the popular saying, all are we is one, into in one is all are we, and argues that the jollification, they have a different term for it in Trinidad, must be used philosophically and pedagogically, it must be taught, if public policy is to be effective and freedom is to be maintained. He believes that the Caribbean is not just a grouping of islands, but is a civilization in itself, in which myths are part of the structure of freedom, and we have a right to make them. The concept that in one is all are we develops a mindset that is the absolute antipathy to selfishness and division, and speaks to the essence of the jollification, which is, my strength comes from your strength, and in your strength I find mine. In combination, we can overcome. Indeed, jollification is the essence of a deeply Christian ethic. My myths tell me that those ancestors who survived war and destruction, who built a church on this spot when they were still legally slaves, who battled drought year in, year out, who claimed and worked a plot of land where a pigeon pea could be planted in a rock hole, who fished, picked wilks freely, or boiled hardbacks and ate gooses in times of famine, who rejected orders to evacuate their island home and stayed put, who found a way to build vessels that became legends in which they carried loved ones overseas to earn a little cash when $15 for 6 months' hard work was considered a jackpot, who paid attention to their faith and held fast to their belief in God, and who had the courage to make a stand for self-determination and succeeded in 1967, were never slaves. and they were always free. If that myth is too simplistic for you, well, it served the English well to believe that St. George killed a dragon, and so they could overcome tyranny and have the courage to rule the world. The Americans believe George Washington never told a lie. So truth, in their view, must be the bedrock of our leadership. Does that have utility? I think it does. So within all that struggle, which had to be endured and which has allowed us to overcome, lie the seeds of empowering myths. And gun violence among young men must be seen as yet another drought that a different kind of jollification can and must overcome. The memory of emancipation demands respect for the memory of our ancestors, for freedom is neither static or just a legal proclamation. Every generation must secure its own liberty, and we in this generation are now challenged to secure it again, not from systems of human enslavement by others, or from drought, or from a resurrected Bradshaw, but from our very own, an enemy within. Every tool in the toolbox must be used, including a deeper appreciation of our humble history and the strength it can supply. But make no mistake, we are in an anxious moment, and the words of Reverend Bill Boda, which now sounds scarily prescient and true, should give us pause. And I end by quoting him again. The future of your island, he said, depends on the faithfulness and devotion of you, this present generation. If you neglect, spurn, or corrupt with superstition that you find on the internet, your religious heritage, you will hand down to those who come after you things less pure and strong. In this way, you would have robbed the next generation of opportunities you had, and thus you would be arraigned as criminals before the bar of history. See that you do not unwittingly commit this great crime by any slackness on your part. Hold fast that which you have. Thank you.
Okay, I'm certain that Mr. Carty deserves another rousing round of applause. And he has let us know that we have work to do. And I'm sure you are enriched by his presentation. And I had questions like, and I also said that myths have no basis in fact, but that was just debunked because our myths have basis in fact. So the new question is, what is the utility of our myths? And I'm sure that you realize that that question was answered as well. Our myths are useful. Thank you for letting us know that, Mr. Carty. And Angola continues to be a paradoxical place. Imagine that the scarcity of resources in the past led to wealth in the recent past. And yes, the contradictions continue. The fact that our drought was something that was systemic, made us have beautiful beaches, which again became a source of wealth. And I'm sure we can also see the evidence of climate change because where's all this rain coming from? I'm sure as you drive around, you would think that you are transported to a windward island with the dense foliage and then all of these showers, these sporadic showers that we keep experiencing. That was a very good presentation. Please give Mr. Carty another round of applause. So now we engage in discussion. We have your questions. I could see some quizzical looks on faces. We have your interpretations, because of course Mr. Carty said that he is presenting his interpretation, and please know that you're free to have yours as well. Another question that I had is, were we always free based on the presentation just now? Or are there different types of freedom, just as we've discovered that there are multiple intelligences? The Caribbean, he said, is a space of freedom. Very interesting. But he also said that each generation has to secure its own liberty. So are we now enslaved in a different way? Do you feel that way? How free do you feel to celebrate the 50th in the way that it has been organized to be? And what do we do to ensure that we regain that freedom? All of those questions I had and more, but please feel free to tell me what your questions are and what your comments are on the presentation we just heard. Who's first? Yes, Lloyd.
Mr. Carter, you made mention of emancipation, and you made not emancipation, jollification, and you made mention of different forms of jollification, and I appreciate the fact in terms of the ills that are happening today. You made mention that we need a jollification in order to overcome these things, and that is something that we really need to do in these times.
Yes, yes. Metaphorically, he said that this is a drought now. All of this violence, this fatal violence, because violence can exist and not be fatal, is another drought that a different kind of jollification must, and in true Anguillan optimistic fashion, he said, can overcome. So, Lloyd, thank you for that contribution.
Yes. As usual, David, excellent. Mm-hmm. I have been thinking a little bit in recent times about innovation in Anguilla, because you normally think of innovation and new techniques as something very large-scale, high-flown, and so on. But I'm sure that for us to survive, right, 1796, to survive drought and famine and so on, we had to cut and contrive. In the process of cutting and contriving, are you aware of any particular solutions, even at a very local level, even in the boat building, when we look at how our skilled shipwrights built the boats and may have come up with solutions? I know there's always a reference to launching boats and the block and tackle and that kind of technology. Speak a little bit more to that, because if we are going to overcome the present drought as we overcome the droughts in the past, one of the things that may inspire us is how we on our own came up with solutions in our context. I can think also, for example, of charcoal burning. When we didn't have picks and shovels and we had hard rock to build a keel, right? A coal keel, as we call it. We didn't go down into the ground. We did it on top of the ground. And we got moss and bush and all sorts of things. So speak to those kinds of creativity that we came up with as a people. In jollification, you talk about the rock hole, planting the peas in the rock hole, bush ground, and so on. Just speak a bit more to that and how that spirit, that element in us, maybe we need to bring that to bear now. Because in the modern economy where we have shifted from subsistence to joining the international economy, we tend to look more to consultants and advisors and what somebody say in a book and so on and so forth and in our consultants' report. And we are not critical. We don't look at what people tell us in a very critical fashion, bringing to bear our own local underground knowledge and experience and relate that to what they tell us, so that what may really work for us is not what they tell us, but what they tell us modified by our knowledge and experience. Speak to that, please.
That's a very hard one, Marcel, but let me try. I can only speak from my own experience.
Reverend Marine is a very good experience, a very good example.
Let me explain that. And it comes back to myth. One of the most incredible shipwrights that Anguilla had, and I will leave his name out of it, and who was a personal inspiration to me, in his skill, refused to believe that man had stood on the moon. There is nothing you could tell him that would persuade him that a man walked on the moon. He was locked into a mindset that was unshakable. At the same time, he was this master craftsman in his own zone. And in his work and in the work of others, he inspired me not to do the technologies that he did, but to move to another step forward. And I wish I had a screen that I could draw to share with you all one of the most remarkable things that Anguillians did as shipbuilders in Island Harbor, in the forest in Sandy Ground, and in Blowing Point in particular. If you imagine a vessel the length of this church, built out of solid wood, not any old light plywood, and it's jacked up, and it's as high as the balcony there or higher. The decks would be up there, the keel would be there in the aisle, and it's up. And for it to be launched, the boat has to be leaned down on its side so that it can rest on rollers, and they haul it down to the sea with big anchors out in the ocean. That they would sink big anchors, and they would tie ropes, and they go back out and come back in, go back out and come back in, and then everybody in the village, and usually you had to kill a cow for that, for the jollification. There were so many people that were necessary. But here's the point. How did they get the vessel down? There were no cranes in Anguilla. No massive cranes to lift something 60 tons and lean it on its side. I couldn't figure that out until one day I saw them launch a small boat in Sandy Ground, and it blew me away. What they did was they got bags, salt bags, from the salt house, and they went up on the hot part of the beach where the sand is blazing hot, way away from the water, but where the sand is fine, and they would shovel up just a few inches off the hot sand, and they would fill the bags with hot sand. And then they would bring these bags one by one and stack them up, imagine again, from the aisle up to what would be called the bilge of the boat. So the bags would be holding up the vessel then, right? One, about 10, 15 of them, right? So once they got all that done, and that could take all day, they then knocked out the jacks where the bags were, and the vessel would just lean gently onto the bags. And then they took out a penknife and cut the bag one at a time, and the sand would trickle out one by one the bags crushed, and one by one, inch by inch, the vessel would come right down. I had to sit down. I couldn't believe it. With no technology and no equipment, they did something like that and haul about 60 to 70 tons. You just heard the news of Hurricane Beryl. People need to be reminded of this. Hurricane Beryl just sank the Jolly Roger, right? The Jolly Roger was built in the forest for Albert Lake.
Yep.
And
It's
named
called
the
New London.
The New London, right? That's history, right? So what I would like to say in trying to answer your question, Marcel, is again, the ethic of community. If the jollification is reinvented, as Rawls believes passionately it should, right? In the circulation of ideas, in the interaction of people thinking and looking and talking, ideas come. I was blown away by that generation, and I committed my life, for better or for worse, to trying to make Anguilla stay within a tradition of excellence in building boats, right? Much smaller and much less complicated than what they had to deal with, right? But the same could be true of any industry. If you look at someone doing something in, I don't know, whatever industry it is, and there's a cross-fertilization of ideas and observation of what is happening, then ideas begin to trigger. And you're so right. We have to find every which way we can to leverage that and, maintain our liberty, if I may use that phrase. So I can't say it fully, Marcel, but that's the best I can do right now.
Well, I think you did a great job.
Yes, I really think so. And thank you, Mr. Foy, for asking that question, because you were asking for some specific examples of problem solving in the past
Absolutely.
that could inspire us to solve our very big problem in the present.
Right.
And we have heard the answer. It is the ethic of community that will do that.
And a mindset
Definitely.
that we can overcome the challenge. We can find a solution.
Right. And it's
to the
not
challenge.
imported.
And
I
we
think
don't
that's the
have to
part.
have the greatest modern technology sometimes to solve it, especially when it comes to the social challenges that we face now. The social drought exemplified in and ethical drought and so on, exemplified in the scourge of gun violence and violence generally.
Thank
you. Thank you, David.
If I may, Madam Chair, Lady, thank you, Mr. Carty, for a wonderful lecture. There's so much I want to say. I saw them trying to pull the fishing vessel, the large fishing vessel in Island Harbor, from the beach into the sea for days with all the modern technology, cranes, backhoes, bulldozers, and couldn't get it to go in the sea. And that's what they did in the old days before. Boats just as big, but they got them in the sea. So many things I want to talk about. I was told not to bring up the same questions about Ireland Harbor, the myths, the shipwreck in Island Harbor, the Anguillans never going to Guyana, so I will not bring up those myths. But I do want to say something which I just came across because I had to look it up in the context of the drought and the Anguillians being here before and the paradoxes of Anguilla. Because in my PhD research, I came across a poem written by, I'll tell you who wrote it afterwards, so it's called Rainbow People. This place knows the feeling of dead hope, stagnant aspiration, the illusion of a rainbow in drought. This place knows this feeling of the promise of evening cool in noonday heat, tomorrow's potential undaunted by the failings of today. This place knows this feeling. It's been here before and survived. Rainbow People by Rita Celestine Carty. And one of my participants in my research was Mr. Marcel Foy, and he referred to the cold keel. Today, I wish I had the opportunity, but I will show you, anybody who wants to see afterwards, I'll show you the pictures I took today of my son-in-law's cold keel. He's just talked about the ideas from other places. The St. Vincent type cold keel. Much bigger than the traditional Anguilla cold keel, bigger than from here to that wall. You can see pictures of it. So that is innovation in Anguilla, using new ideas that are imported from other places, but which has certainly results, improved results, much improved results. So I want to thank you for your presentation. It is really touching. I think you saw my paper that I wrote for this award today. But I know in my paper that I referred a lot to what you had written before. So again, it's this transfer of ideas and knowledge. And I do mention a lot of what you say. And I want to mention something that is very important to us. Your lecture mentions journeys. My paper is Leaving the Island, Migration Patterns. But in the future, in the next few months, we are going to be hosting, Anguilla is going to be hosting the 8th Caribbean Symposium on Genealogy and History. And the theme, right here, the theme for that is diaspora, journeys, research, and reparations. The word reparations wasn't mentioned today, I don't think. But all of these come together in this theme, and we want to invite everybody. There's a call for papers that's being published, and we invite everybody to participate, to present papers, to make this a great occasion. Thank you very much for your lecture. There's so much we want to talk about.
I just want to follow on, thanks Tim, on the jollification thing. To show you jollification is not just holding ground or pouring cement. I see Linda here and Marcel just left. I don't think anybody else was here. But we produced a play way back in 70 what, Linda? Malliouhana. Before we did that play, nobody knew the name Malliouhana. That's a fact. That's long before the hotel. That's long before Malliouhana Cooperative. That's long before any Malliouhana. We dug up from a little old book that my father had, and I produced the play, and I used my theater skills, which were fresh at that time. Here's the point. Malliouhana was a really first-class production that was taken to Carifesta, got all sorts of accolades to the Virgin Islands and to Trinidad. It was the subject of a philosophical discussion in Trinidad about social development and the attitudes of slave societies to development. The discussions that took place in Trinidad about Malliouhana, I did not understand, because them fellas were way up there, right? But here's the point. The way I was the director of Malliouhana, yes, but Malliouhana was done through improvisations. So if I wanted Linda to do a certain part or to move to a certain play, which is the director's prerogative, she would have to find her own words to express that position or what she did. Same with Marcel, same with your late sister, Gloria, who was one of the stars of the play, and everybody else. Improvisation asks you to put your intellect and your passion and your emotion into it, whatever it may be. And to this day, I know, I'm not asking, I know that the success of that play was because of improvisation and not by a scripted playwright who wrote every line that every actor had to follow. So, you know, Raul is right. You have to look at jollification differently. And sometimes I think we fall into the trap of feeling jollification by that old-time stuff. That's peas and corn. Peas and rice is very nice. If you eat it once, you're going to eat it twice. You know, that kind of thing. It's not. It's not. It has a modern utility if we look at it differently. Sorry.
Okay, in the back, I see a hand. Yes. Oh, it's Pamavan. Hi, Pamavan. You want to come to the mic so everybody can hear you?
Good evening, everyone. David, that was just an amazing presentation. And while I was not surprised that it would be excellent, what really touched me was that you relied on so many diverse authorities. I couldn't imagine that I'd be in a presentation, an emancipation lecture, looking at myth and, you know, the thinking of Joseph Campbell, for instance, and then talking about the spiritual connection with the land and all of that. But what my question for you has to do with, it has to do with where you started, and you talked about this book you'd read about, you know, the anxious people. I can't remember exactly now who the writer is. I'm going to look it up. I know it's a trending social psychologist. But you spoke about the anxious thoughts, the anxious emotions, the anxious behaviors. And I wonder to what extent, perhaps, that configuration or that approach would yield some kind of a solution for the gang violence and the, you know, just the general violence that we're experiencing. And, you know, our own form of anxiety, as you described, even in this moment where supposedly we're free. I want you to think about that a little bit across, and you have shared thoughts, but the Reverend who wrote so beautifully and who you relied on so much in describing, you know, the Anguillian, you know, that Anguillian identity. I don't know that you could apply that, those same labels to where we are now. And it was with a little bit of sadness that I stretched that reality that you'd created for me into the situation with the boats and the boat racing and the nearly 300 people who will be on those boats and, you know, focused, and how with just perhaps one arbitrary incident, because, you know, there's always the Island Harbor and the West End and the Blowing Point and the, you know, which we know the boats and, you know, like that, but, and it's not for fear, but it's a reality. How can we, with all of that, all of those resources and all the incredible creativity that I know we're all capable of here, how are we going to do it? And I loved that you shared about Malliouhana and the unique way you directed it, because maybe it's that kind of opportunity again that could yield that outcome, but somebody needs to direct. And the reason why I believed we had such a terrible experience with the boat in Island Harbor getting it down is because nobody, sadly, had shared that bit of knowledge before. I say that, you know, I'm quite familiar with boats and stuff like that, but it hadn't occurred to me. And I know that all the fishermen and all the people struggling to get it down there and all those incredible machines, I mean, if we had that little bit of knowledge. Well, there you go. And that has, well, I didn't know it. But that has to do with transmission. And I think that is what the Reverend was asking us to do as well. How are we going to transmit it? So any thoughts you can share on that? And again, thanks for another brilliant, brilliant presentation. I don't know what we'll do when you are no longer with us, if that happens. No, listen. You know, this is the age we're in. We're anxious people. Yes, thanks a lot. God bless you. God bless Anguilla.
Okay, thank you very much. And Canavan spoke about transmission, and Jancy said we have it, but we've lost it. So that brings us to the discussion on the anchors that Mr. Carty says are slipping. And those anchors include frugality, cutting and contriving, spiritual discipline, loyalty to land, to family, to home. And these are being replaced by globalization, although maybe that has had its day, lower regard for morality, and greater individualism. And PAM is not for somebody to do it. I think Mr. Carty made it clear that all of us have to do it.
David, again, excellent presentation. And I think the right person had been chosen for this session, given your maritime experience, because in my opinion, a large part of Anguilla's emancipation had been achieved through the sea. Our forefathers and their initiatives, their skills, Abraham Lincoln's skills going way back, no power tools, and they built those magnificent schooners. We spoke about how they were launched into the sea. But when they got them into the sea, eventually, with that mammoth task, their journey had just begun. The purpose of the boat was to go to other islands, and we needed a skill in manning these boats. Perhaps in those days, they didn't even have compasses. I hear stories coming from a maritime family, how they sailed by this star and that star. And in a modern world, we have GPS that tells us where the reefs and the islands were. And it makes us quiver to imagine how our forefathers who manned those boats, sailed all the way to the Dominican Republic and got to all those islands without being, shipwrecked. We've made it as a people, and you brought it out. We were emancipated through resilience. We didn't have the technology. They had abandoned us because Anguilla did not have the resources back in those days, agriculture, no, and we were left alone. And we had to connect with the rest of the world, and we did it skillfully by the building of these boats. I recall as a youngster going to school in the road, we didn't have the lifts to pull the boats out of the water. And they used to take the boats, heel it over onto another boat till the boat kicked up out of the water. And then they went into small boats with tools and took off the barnacles and then painted the bottom. And after weeks of doing that, they turned it around, leaned it over like it was sinking onto another boat, removed the barnacles. History. Because we were people so resilient, we found ways to do things. And I know that's an area of your passion, or various sea captains that connected us to the rest of the world, many who lost their lives. They are our heroes. And I'm always heartened to come in your boatyard and delighted that you have picked up that industry to a higher level, because it had died out in Anguilla. And again, we are connected to the rest of the world with the most magnificent custom yachts. And, you know, we as a people being resilient, and that resilience is kind of lost today. And we have a lot of work to do to bring it back. But excellent discussion. And I know if you were to talk about how the marine life, the rest of the marine life, when the boats were launched, how it continued with the emancipation, it probably will take several other sessions here. But thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Romney.
Yeah, I think I'm on. Yeah. Since Claude asked me that question, I would love to share this little story with you, which doesn't have, although it deals with boats and schooners, as Claude says, it shows the spiritual connection of people who are into what they have and who they are, and their identity is totally complete in what they do, which was the generation before 1967 that came out of all of this. Claude is the grandson of the great legendary captain from Blowing Point, Joe Romney. I had the privilege as an 11-year-old boy to meet Joe Romney in St. Kitts. He looked just like Claude, but he 100 pounds smaller. My grandfather was the builder of the legendary schooner Warspite, and he gave the Warspite total control on the Warspite to Captain Joe Romney. Here's the true story. Brought tears to my eyes when I first heard it. My father was, as a young candidate for the ministry, working under the superintendent in St. Kitts. He hadn't been ordained yet. He was still reading a lot of the Bible. And the church told him he had to go to Montserrat. He had to move to Montserrat. Those days, there's no Liat, there's no flights. So you go down on a jetty and you look for a boat that's going to Montserrat. And out of the blue, in comes the Warspite with Captain Joe Romney as the captain. So he said, oh, that's my father's boat. I must catch a lift and I gotta pay for it. So Captain Joe said, of course, come. We're going to Dominica, we'll stop in at Montserrat. And my father tells a story that when the Warspite was sailing, Captain Joe sat on the wheel. There's a wheel box and it's, the ship's wheel with the spokes. And he would hold the top spokes with his 2 hands, and the bottom spokes he would hold with his 2 feet. So he had the wheel in 4 positions. And then he saw a squall coming down from Antigua, and he knew that could be tricky this time of year, hurricane season. So he ordered the crew to reef the sails. Reef the sails meaning you shorten the sails. Instead of this high, you lower them a little bit so that the pressure on the schooner was not as much. And just before the squall hit, he told my father, he said, okay, you go down here in this cabin, stay down there until the squall is passed. So my father had to go down, but he was in a position where he could look back up straight at Captain Joe because the cabin was right in front of the wheel. So he could see Captain Joe. And he said, so he couldn't see the sea, he couldn't hear the wind. All he could see was Captain Joe, but he felt when the squall hit the vessel, all the creaking and groaning of the shrouds and the vessel heeling. And in all that maelstrom, he said he saw Captain Joe with 2 feet on the wheel, with 1 hand on a spoke, and with his right hand stroking the wheel, and simply saying over and over, take it easy, Warspite. Captain Joe got you. Take it easy, Warspite. Captain Joe got you. A spiritual connection with a thing, right? A spiritual connection with a thing, because that was his life. And it speaks to the passion that that generation may have had, which I think, and I've come back to myth. I don't know if Captain Joe was a good man or a bad man. I don't know if Captain Joe treated his family well or not. He didn't. I don't know anything about him except that he is, for me, a hero. That is my myth. Try to take it from me.
Can't.
You know, this is where the power of myths come. We all, I think, all of us, have some ancestor, some family member, somebody out there who is special, who is an example, who has touched us. And we might know what kind of wickedness they were up to when they were in their teen. I don't know. But there is a myth that supports you in your everyday life because of that reverence you have for that. And that is why myths are important. And in the same way they can be effective for us individually, they can be very effective for us nationally. And this is the time, I think, that maybe we need to go look for them and hold on to them for dear life. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I have to highlight here the innovation, the time, the dedication and passion, the faith, and that ethic of community. And then we saw that loyalty to family that just came out when Mr. Romney defended his grandfather. He did every single day. So we have Ursula, and then after we'll have Carlisle.
Yes, I must say thanks to the organizers for this session.
Okay, sorry, Ursula, I have to say something as I see these people standing now. So I'm going to acknowledge Miss Janet Lake, history teacher at the Albina Lake Hodge Comprehensive School. Please give her a round of applause for being here. And the two ladies that went out just in front of her, I don't know if you can get them to come back, Miss Lake, so that they can be acknowledged. They are founding members of a new club at school called Caribbean Time. And they are going to be, yes. So here they are, young ladies. So we're making sure that we transmit. Please give them a big, inspiring round of applause. So thank you, Ms. Lake, for bringing them, and have a good night. Okay, Ursula, sorry for the interruption.
What I was going to say would have been exactly connected to the children.
Oh, okay.
So you can say what you were.
So children, you have to listen.
It was a pleasure to be here. The lecture was very informative. As I was listening, I was thinking about the myth of slavery in Angola. Historians have written that there was less than 3,000 enslaved persons in Angola. And at that time, the economic activities that were being done in Angola did not facilitate slavery like the other Caribbean territories. So the myth that slavery was not really slavery in Angola could be tied into fact, right? Because before, Mrs. Carty did say that fact had no bearing. A myth had no bearing in fact. But we found out that myths also are part of what make, well, facts are also part of what makes myth. Because the 300 enslaved Africans that were part of the church, right? They, due to how slavery was in other societies, enslaved Africans could not hold any positions in church, okay? So maybe that is where the myth of no slavery being found in Angola came from. All in all, the lecture was very informative. I'm gonna go home and listen to it again, and I'm also gonna share it with my students.
Thank you.
I must say thanks to the organizers And I hope that we'll continue to keep this lecture going on, particularly at this place, as we say, it started with the Ebenezer, and to take up from Mr. Carty, thank you too for accepting to come. And as always, you do these good presentations. Now, as I encourage the lady to come back, it's because when I came in and I saw the scant popular audience, and then after the build-up, but then I'm looking for more youthful people, and I'm not seeing that. And then I saw these two children behind there with that person, you know? So I was saying, even though sometimes it seems as if all is lost, all is not lost.
Never.
There will always be a remnant to do something. And as you read the scriptures, many passages you are finding which speaks about the remnants. And as Reverend Mr. Carter spoke about the spiritual connection, it was there where I was getting up to talk. Now, you know I'm a rights woman and a free woman and whatnot. So we say with the church, we are free people in Anguilla. Yes, we know we had slavery and whatever, even though people didn't say, but we didn't stay there. A small island like Anguilla with 35 square miles and over 40, nearly 50 churches I'm hearing. I know when it was 33. We do have freedom. When you look at in the news the other day, shutting up now so that we can get out. A few days ago, when you were hearing about the places in different countries where the churches are burned down and things like that. Some morning I see a man that I know I listen to on the TV. And the man is just saying, and you can actually see the flames in the temple, you know, and things like that. So in Ghana, we are blessed. And as you spoke about, you know, when we used to have these big trucks doing all this concrete thing and thing, our people had do things what? And now that we have so many funerals, man, I'm delighted when I go to the funerals and I see the young boys that we had in school. Some mightn't have come out with no degrees and what have you, but they're shoveling up the thing and whatnot. And even the young boys that we saw with this big boat up in Island Harbor and whatnot. And you talk about raking the salt, right? The young people now, they're actually going down there and going down in the salt. When I was a little girl, they didn't have cars. You go down there and you bring up some little paint bucket on your head and you walk from sandy ground to stony ground, right? But now I find myself going in the pond with the young people when the youth group's carrying them, and we go down, man, and we know how to break up a bunch of salt and wash it off and things like that. So I am still out there helping. I'm not writing. I had started writing. Got enough writers now. So I'm promoting people to carry on, and we'll have some of everything, okay? We can just carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Good evening, Mr. Carty. Congratulations on an excellent presentation. I believe I know what you went through to prepare for this evening. And sorry for being late, Dr. Banks, and thanks for the invitation. 2 points and then a question. To the extent that myth helps a people, then they have value. And so I agree with you on that point. To Mrs. Carty, in the context of the fact that aridity, drought, back then led to wealth now, perhaps you could look at it from a biblical point of view, or perhaps Martin Luther King's view or comment that I have seen the promised land and I may not get there with you, in the context that the poverty of years gone by was necessary for those who would come after to reap the riches that would follow. I didn't cause that, sorry. I did spend some time in the Middle East and I picked up a similar theme, the Bedouin tribes people who spent centuries occupying the desert. When oil was found, then became wealthy. So the same concept applied there. I agree, Mr. Carty, that perhaps the myth that there was no slavery here may have had some benefit. But my question to you is, at what point does a myth, especially in the context of slavery, become a serious problem? Because I think that is also something that we should ponder. Thank you.
That's a very good question. You do not want to jump to the conclusion that that slavery was a myth in slavery didn't exist in Angola, that myth takes root. And that's why I think I was clear in saying that is an absurdity. We had slavery. Slavery did exist. Slaves were sold under the mahogany tree, where Albert Lake's building is today. But in differentiating the three sections of our history, if you look at Angola before 1796, Angola is a classic plantation society with all the evils, all the brutality, and all the economic slavery that existed. Angola was no different, no different. It is that transition of destruction and persistent drought that made things wobble. And I think I was clear in saying, you know, the cooperation that existed wasn't any altruism. Oh no, it was the exigencies of existence. So yes, you're right. We have to be careful that you propagate a myth to such an extent that it becomes the truth. And I do not advocate that. I would never tell a student that there was no slavery in Angola. But I will try and explain, as I've tried to do tonight, that the amelioration that took place because of economic and social and institutional collapse has, in my view, served us well in the long run, not in the immediate run. The 1826 House of Commons report has the record of a murder of a Negro boy, right, a slave. And you, in the first part I read, you will note he said acts of the most despicable nature are conducted with impunity. So, you know, that ugly part of what slavery was definitely here. But because it flipped, because of war and circumstance, we have become the beneficiaries, or the generation up to 1967 become the beneficiaries. Why I say that we are still a work in progress is that, of course, 1967 was perhaps the most historic year in our entire history. And that changed the trajectory completely for Angola. Well, we are still a work in progress. A lot of us here were still alive in 1967. So we are part of that process, and we have a generational duty to ensure that all the hard work and the amazing progress that Angola has made since then is not now dissipated because we have not held fast to those values that Reverend Balboa said, because at the end of the day, that is what he was talking about, values. And if we let them go as a result of the internet, and I am, like Jonathan Haddett, I am scared of the internet. I am scared to see you go to a restaurant and two people having dinner and the two of them on their phone. You know, they're not talking to each other. As soon as something stops, the phone comes out, right? And what are you looking at? Well, in the case of young men and young women, parents have to be now doubly careful. And if there are young mothers or single mothers who have to hold on 2 or 3 jobs, do they have the time to monitor this? These are the things that make us anxious, and these are the things that perhaps are one of the reasons why we have the difficulty we have today. And it takes all of us to deal with it.
All right, serious words. So there again, we have our paradoxes and the fact that emancipation is a journey and every generation has to try to liberate itself. So now we have Dr. Banks.
David, all of we is one, and one is all of we. We're all in that anxious moment together. Sometimes we forget that those who are perpetuating the violence are also anxious. And they're perpetuating the violence because they are anxious. So empathy is something we need to work on while we realize that all of us are in that boat together. If I was to ask anybody in this room, are you anxious on a scale of 1 to 10? I would say I'm like way up there, you know? Because we're not sure what's going to happen next. We're waiting for the ball to drop. And so, David, thank you very much for your presentation. All are we is one, and one is all are we. If we think about that, and if we process that, and we see the Bible tells us we are our brother's keeper, we are our sister's keeper. If we have that view of life, it can change a lot of stuff. It's not going to change overnight. You talk about the internet. For several years, I don't have a TV on in my room. It caused me some anxious days and nights. I thank people like Mr. Pickering and Lloyd who have been bringing images of us on the TV. But the TV has a job to exacerbate our anxiety. That's how they get their ratings. You know, and we are like sheep. We follow them. We turn it on and we soak it up. And then we become anxious. And our young people have the phone in their hands, and that's a sign of manhood and womanhood, this phone in my hand. But what are the messages that are being perpetuated there? So we are all are we is one, and in one is all are we. If we adopt that mentality, that's the whole jollification mentality. All of us are in this together. The other night I had something in memory of my mother. She gathered us around and told stories and sang songs, and we learned them. How many mothers, how many fathers are gathering the children around and telling them stories? Telling them stories and teaching them songs. Is that a tradition that we're losing? Have we lost it? Can we regroup it? Can we take it back? I think we need to examine these things carefully, because we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can't throw out the oral tradition, you know, with the electronic tradition. Of course, progress has a way of marching on in spite of. How can we use the progress to help us rid of ourselves of some of this anxiety? How can we look at the young people in our community? If I turn back, how can we look at the young people in our community and know that they're not bandits? They're not bad people. They are anxious too. We are all in an anxious moment. How can we try our best to reach out to those around us who are anxious, not as our enemies, but as people who are part of us? All are we is one, and in one is all are we. I think that's a wonderful quotation. So let's do what we can to help each other.
Yes, I agree. And thank you for stressing that interdependence. We saw that interdependence broke down barriers in 1796, so there was no distinctions between the haves and the have-nots, and everybody had to try to eke out a living. Everybody was at the level of subsistence, and yet we are here because we are rainbow people. And also, I like the fact that you talked about the anxious generation being inclusive of all of us. So there again, that breaks down all the barriers. It's not us versus them, all anxious and expressing it in different ways. But we have to have that spirit of fellowship that expresses it in a way that takes us to a new time of freedom. Reverend Celestine?
Thank you again, Brother Carty. Sitting down there, I felt proud to associate, if I should say so, with the Methodist Church, just listening. And the question is not for you, but for all of us. I really, the way that you presented that spiritual element, highlighting the spiritual element in your presentation, and the question and the label, as was said early on by this minister, in terms of the description that he gave to the people of faith, to the people of Anguilla. And then he asked the question, well, then he said, he commented, hold fast that which you have. And so my question for us, where are we as it relates to this description as people of faith? From the different Christian denominations, where are we? And I think that is something each one of us need to ask ourselves, because there is now that, in terms of the society, there seems to be a disconnect in terms of church and what is happening within our society. There is not that respect even for that institution, the church, anymore. There is not that fear of God. And so we have to ask ourselves, as a people, we were told to hold fast, or we are now hearing, where are we as it relates to those labels and the descriptions that were said of us?
Thank you very much. If we are not holding fast, that charge is repeated in a very timely manner tonight. And speaking about the internet, and because we are an anxious generation, and because I was introduced as a career educator, and that only doesn't happen in a classroom, I wanted to share some things about making us less anxious. And that's very important. These are trending words. Take a mental break. People keep asking me if I'm taking a mental break. Mental breaks are important. It's also sometimes important, not only for young people, but older people are also glued to their phones, to take social media detoxes. You have to put them away, put them in a different room from where you are, and do something else for a while. You should also seek good news, because as Dr. Banks says, and other people as well, it's the bad news that triggers us and that sells and that gets all of the views. So consciously seek out good news, and also accept good news, because people don't really like to accept good news. You know, it's almost like, okay, so what? But if it's bad news, tell me again. So we have to really shift that kind of thinking and seek out and accept good news, and then also the spiritual life that Reverend Celestine was referring to, and also being community-minded and making sure that we engage in fellowship such as we are doing here now. All of those are very important to do, and we should not only keep that to ourselves when we, find out those secrets, and they're so simple. None of those things cost anything, and we should share them with one another, young and old, to make sure that we remain healthy in this awesome space called Anguilla, which will be awesome again. So, which is awesome, it's true. As I drive along the road and I see how beautiful it looks, as I came up there, I said, this is really like a paradise. It really is. It's the human component we have to work on, but the space itself is an awesome space. Okay? So maybe we can wrap up our conversation, because we are going to talk again next year, right, Malliouhana Poetry Committee? And we can talk in between as well. So at this time, I would like to invite Mr. Sanford Richardson for an expression of thanks.
Someone once said that giving a vote of thanks is not an opportunity or an occasion to give a speech. So I'll try to heed those words. Cultural anchors and myths, revisioning our emancipation journey. As we come to the end of another evening in commemoration of emancipation and the 194th anniversary of Ebenezer Chapel, the Malliouhana Poetry Emancipation Lecture Organizing Committee. When I call your name, just put your hand up, please. Avon Carty, Annika Hughes, Carla Harris, John C. Webster, Renee Henry, and Phyllis Fleming Banks. And the Ebenezer congregation, we'd like to thank our presenter, Mr. David Carty. I add in here, I've said it before and I say it again proudly, he was my favorite teacher in high school, and that is no myth. Well, thank you, Mr. Carty, for a dynamic, thought-provoking, enriching, and educational presentation, and all the response that your presentation evoked. Mrs. Rita Celestine Carty, for so ably chairing the proceedings. We want to thank you as well. The Honorable Minister, Social Development, Mrs. Deanne Kentish Rogers, for taking the time to be here and for her remarks and challenge for wider involvement in this activity or exercise. You can clap her now. Our Superintendent Minister, Reverend Vincent Celestine, who offered up prayers, and the Methodist Circuit and Anguilla and the Ebenezer family for continuing to partner with us to ensure the continuation of this annual lecture series. Mr. Lennox Vanterpool, organist Roots Bingi, and the Ebenezer Men's Fellowship for their continued contribution and thought through music and song. I believe at this juncture I should do this. Roots Bingi would have, since we were last year, would have lost one of their members, Elvin Ibo Brooks. And if I'm not asking too much, here we go. I invite us to stand just for a moment in recognition. May his soul rest in peace. Please be seated. Mrs. Stella Gums, for your assistance in distributing the Reverend Dr. Richard Gums Award. Every year, I guess you become even more proud of him and the work that he has done, and for your continued support of this initiative to celebrate the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Richard Gums. We again applaud and congratulate all the participants, including Dr. Timothy Hodge for his winning submission and Mrs. Charlene Gums for her contribution as well. We are particularly grateful to D3 Enterprises and Council Corporate Services for their financial contributions to help make this event possible. And of course, we must thank the media, Radio Anguilla, Lloyd's Live, KCN Television, Class FM, Cool FM, Upbeat Radio, the Anguillian newspaper for their part in promoting and covering this particular lecture. Big up to the Ebenezer technical team upstairs. Thank you as well. Our colleagues at the University of West Indies Global Campus Anguilla, the Anguilla Library Service, the Department of Youth and Culture, and the Department of Education, we thank you. And most importantly, we especially thank you, the audience, those who have joined us here at the historic Ebenezer Chapel in the Valley Anguilla, and those who joined us online for sharing in this experience. Give yourselves a round of applause. We have tokens of appreciation for the speaker and the chairperson that we will distribute immediately following after I leave the lectern. So I'm going to invite a person now to do that, and I wish all of you a pleasant night after we sing our closing song.
Thank you very much, Brother Sanford. And on behalf of the Malliouhana Poetry Organizing Committee, we want to say a very special thank you to Rita Celestine Carty again for doing such an able and wonderful job. Congratulations. This one is for our good friend David Carty. I think every time he gets a call from Jan Zirai, he's like, oh no, what are you? But we know what we have, and we are extremely grateful for your contributions. And so we prepared this little, in this Anguilla colors, we wanted to say, on behalf of the Malliouhana Poetry Committee, we want to say to Mr. David Carty, thank you for your contributions to the development, to the continued development of Anguilla.
So we stand and sing the right hand of God. Receive the benediction. Go in peace. Make a difference in your world. Respect each other. Be filled with empathy. Enjoy your freedom and give God thanks in all things. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.